Good morning, good afternoon, Professor Barry here. Hey, I just want to let you know we're halfway through the term. If you are struggling in any sort of way, or you want feedback, or you just want to connect, talk about sociology, you're interested in maybe careers that are related to sociology. There's a lot of programs that tie into or tap into a lot of the content or ideas that we explore in sociology. Could be things ranging from public policy is a very popular program. And those are oftentimes bachelor or master's level programs, a lot of good job opportunities in public policy. And that's a big, wide scope of opportunities in terms of educational as well as occupational opportunities in that space. Even things like urban planning, be related, pre-law, working in criminology and criminal justice system. And there's a lot of different applications. So if you are interested in the subject area, the content, and you're thinking about, what are some options and choices, or you just want to talk about sociology, let me know, and we can make that happen. And then if you're struggling in any sort of way, I'm here to help support you. So please don't hesitate to reach out. And we can either meet up in Zoom or just email, whatever it may be, whatever works best for you. All right, so last week we moved into deviance, talked about before that, laid out the foundation for the class, the first 4 weeks of the term, 5 weeks of the term. And now we're moving into kind of like some detail areas. And this is true now, where this week it's social stratification, income, wealth. And then we move on to race and class stratification the next 2 weeks. I'm trying to figure something out here. Hold on a second. So with stratification, this is like these areas of stratification, social stratification, race and gender are major areas of discussion in sociology, as well as a lot of areas in social sciences. We're talking about the impact of structure on groups of people, and we're thinking about how society is organized and arranged, and like the history behind that, some of the impacts of that different levels of stratification. And ultimately, if you kind of go back to like the ideal culture, practice culture, we have an ideal culture view, maybe that the world is fair, that it's just, that people have the sort of opportunities that are there, that it's equal and open to everyone. But the practice culture is a lot different. And it seems like, to me at least, that if we're going to try to get closer to that ideal culture, we have to understand how the practice culture works and operates in order to become more educated and informed about the practice world, and then also encourage kind of a movement towards putting our ideal cultural values and ideals and stories we tell, put them into practice, so to align them better. Okay, with that being said, let's kind of move on to the content of stratification and social stratifications. For looking at stratification, we're looking at basically, a layering. This is a picture of the painted desert out in John Day. And, we're looking at basically a stratification as a layering of different things, of status, resources. How is society stratified in terms of distribution of resources, distribution of power, distribution of status? So why is it that way? How is it different in different places? How is it different for different subgroups within society, whether that be race or region of the country? From a sociological perspective, or maybe just sort of just a general perspective, there's nothing inevitable about stratification. Stratification is a result of a lot of complex factors, economic factors, but also social and political factors too. And not just like an individual choice, like where people end up in that stratified order isn't just based on individual choice. Like where you start on this sort of this range of stratification has an impact on your day-to-day experience, your opportunities, and potentially your long-term life stuff. So stratification Yeah, it's hierarchy, it's a layering. And one way to approach thinking about stratification, I think these three principles help a lot. They kind of give us some ways of thinking about stratification that can be pretty helpful. One is that to recognize that it's universal across time and place. I mean, you'd have to go back, humans have been around, Homo sapiens have been around for 200,000 years approximately. Mostly nomadic communities for a long period of time, and then moving into hunting and gathering in communities. In both those communities and societies, it was relatively, the stratification was relatively minimal. Once we get to the development of agricultural-based societies 6,000, 7,000 years ago, the Fertile Crescent, ancient Egypt, the development of larger civilizations in Central America, South America, different places around the globe. Once we get into that space, now all of a sudden it's going to be stratification. It's universal across all communities that are a certain size and larger, that have, like, from an agricultural-based society to industrial capitalism and forward. It's universal, but also recognizing that it's variable, so that we're not going to get rid of stratification. I don't think. I think it's universal. It's here to stay. But it's also variable, which says, okay, now the question becomes one, okay, why is it variable? Are there things that are going on, like, is it the economic or is it the social, cultural things that are going on that's influencing the degrees of variability? And then what's the impact on people and society when we're thinking about different degrees of stratification? So we'll talk about each of these in more detail, but universal and variable, persistent and resistant to change. So we also got to understand that stratification is very hard to change. I mean, we can do it at the individual level. We have some power and influence of where we end up, self-determination. We're making choices in our environment. So, but stratification at a larger level, it is hard to change. The degrees of which wealth distribution, income distribution, these are larger economic and political forces, and they're hard to change. There could be either a vested interest in keeping it the way that it is, or there's political stuff going on that's preventing more active involvement and change, or whatever it may be. It's just got to recognize that it's hard to change. And then third, and I think this is really important, that the degree of stratification in a society is supported by ideologies. And we'll talk about ideologies, which are basically beliefs within society itself. So we'll talk about this idea of ideology. We have different ideas about stratification. I'll just present two here, and we'll talk about Durkheim or functionalism a little bit later. But for Marx's perspective, stratification, let me back up for a moment. Marx was a political scientist, and he was a philosopher. He was interested in economic systems of political economy, or economic systems. He took a long-term view, early human communities all the way to capitalism, industrialization, industrial capitalism. And what he was looking at is, how does the material structure, the economic structure, influence, like, how society gets organized? And so for Marx, like, the key part, it's the economic system that determines the organization of society itself. So that in an agricultural-based society, that's going to determine how society is being organized. Could be like an agricultural-based community. Family sizes are much larger. There's less stratification. There is stratification, but there's less degrees of stratification. It's a different kind of system. We move to industrial capitalism. We're in a different system. Family sizes tend to go down for a lot of different reasons. Crime, poverty, other things start to become more pronounced. And for Marx, it has to do with the economic structure itself. And capitalism produces a certain degree of stratification. It's an inevitable byproduct of creating the haves and the have-nots in a class-based system. And so for Marx, your position in society is marked by your relationship to production. So are you an owner or are you a worker? And I mean, that's kind of like, for Marx, a major distinction. Those who are at the seats of power, those who have controlling the labor, and those who are controlled by labor conditions. So for Marx, that's kind of a key determining part. For Weber has more of an interactionist kind of viewpoint a little bit, where he brings in that rank in society, stratification, your rank, your status, your position. It is a combination of different factors. It's your wealth, how much you own, whether that's both income and your assets. So how much wealth could influence your degree of stratification or your rank. There's also the prestige or status of the position that you occupy. A religious leader, for example, may not have a lot of wealth, but they may have a lot of status and prestige within a community. It could be that a person who's working in the trades, who's a skilled master plumber, a master electrician, and makes a lot of money, a lot more money than maybe a school teacher, but the school teacher may have more status in society itself. So Weber's kind of recognizing a little bit that there's a difference in terms of cultural value that's placed on occupations and things like that. And then there's also the issue for Weber of power, like how much power do people within a particular segment of society actually hold and have? So that, you got to separate out wealth and power. It could be that people have a lot of wealth. They also have a lot of power to control the conditions of society itself, or, but we have to, but maybe not, right? So wealth doesn't automatically mean that you have power. So Weber's making a distinction between the two. So let's talk about a couple different systems of stratification. We have a closed system of stratification. The caste-based systems are, the most oftentimes think about India. When people think about a caste-based system, in a caste-based system, it's closed. There is no mobility. The position that you are born into is the position you stay in. Rankings in society are determined by birth. So if we go back to the idea of ascribed status, you are born into a particular class position. That's the position that you stay in. India is going through change. It's like that system is going through, as it's become more interacting with the Western world and ideas and just modernization, those ideas within India are also going through change. But still a lot of stuff that's much more of a closed system than you might find elsewhere. If you think about, like, that's one system, right? Like, that's a system of stratification. There's aristocracies. Think about, I don't know, think about Europe and think about England, think about France, think about places that had a monarchy, that it's basically it's genetic lineage. So it's basically familial background. So you have the royal family, those who are in that top position within society, the kings in society, the queens, the princes, the princesses. Those are all landed, based on family lineage. Then you get below that, the lords and the nobles. Below that, the knights, then the peasants, right? So that's a system of organization and a system of stratification. Well, now we move to like a more class-based system. So we can move to capitalism started to develop 1700s, 1800s. Now we're getting into a different kind of system. And we get into a class-based system where there are degrees of mobility. This becomes like the American dream kind of model, or in other places that there's an opportunity. The class you're born into doesn't determine where you end up, or your family lineage doesn't determine where you end up. There's some degree of mobility within a class system, but recognizing that it's variable, right? Go back to that one principle, that there's degrees of variability in terms of mobility. Let's pull back or go back to our term ideal culture versus practice culture. The ideal culture in the United States is that people have a lot of mobility. The practice culture, as we'll talk about here in a little bit, is there's less mobility than maybe people think, or less than what we promote as being the ideal. Then we can think about the social construction of reality. What are our beliefs about, or what are the ways in which people see the degree of mobility? Do they think there's a lot of mobility or not a lot? Is it accurate or inaccurate? And where do our ideas of mobility come from themselves? I bring up these two books here just to kind of demonstrate that, we have, in the United States and Western democracies, class-based system, there's mobility, but also there's a lot of caste-like features also in the United States. Michelle Alexander is known for her work on criminal justice policies as being expressing the new Jim Crow being laws and regulations in the United States starting in the late 1800s all the way to 1954 with Brown versus Board of Education and the desegregation of public institutions. And that, that Jim Crow laws were a way of legal segregation and basically creating a caste-like system in the United States along racial lines. So she talks about how criminal justice policies, and I think you could extend that to other institutions, that policies are actually reinforcing or create a caste-like system. It's in more contemporary form, less maybe direct, less obvious, but there's a component there. That's the argument that she's providing. And then you have a book like Caste, Isabel Wilkerson, I think very provocative, that for Wilkerson, she's bringing forward the idea that America is a caste system. That we definitely doesn't mean that there's no mobility, but that class and caste-like features have always been a fundamental part of American culture and society. So in a lot of ways, you could read this as she's really challenging that ideal cultural view, the mythology we tell. And I think she has a really compelling argument about how society has been set up in American culture and society, that there's some caste-like features that are here. So let's talk about each of the different principles of stratification. Let's kind of walk through those and then get into some other things. So first of all, recognizing stratification is universal but variable. So if we think about one way of looking at this is called the Gini coefficient. So the Gini coefficient is a measurement of the degree of inequality within a society. So it's very macro level. So it's looking at basically the proportion of a population, like here's the proportion of population compared to the income and wealth that they hold. So if you have one person holding all of the wealth, that's perfect inequality. If you have the cumulative population holding all the same resources, that's perfect equality. So there's this sort of measurement that's been established that governmental bodies use to look at basically degrees of inequality within a society. Countries that are the lowest, Slovenia has the lowest, 24. Gini coefficient, and then you go through these different countries. A lot of the Nordic countries have relatively low Gini coefficient. The highest is South Africa, 63, Brazil, 53. I mean, those numbers may not mean a lot as far as like it's hard to wrap your head around like what's the difference between a 24 and a 63. But those are like huge, significant structural differences in society, the degree in which there's that gap between the top and the bottom, the degree of income and wealth inequality. And then you get, the United States is at 41. I put here Germany and France just to kind of indicate that this capitalism doesn't, there's a lot of variability within capitalism. I mean, one thing I'm trying to convey, hopefully, is that we have in the United States, a particular way of organizing capital. Capital gets organized in different countries in different ways. There's not one way to organize capital. In other countries, they have less inequality. Germany, a very proto-capitalist country, but they also have a country that's much more equal than it is here in the United States. This data is coming from the Economically Developed Countries OECD. It's actually 2016, so just to let you know. Okay, so we can look at also mobility and rates of mobility, movement up and down. That's social mobility. There's different kinds of mobility. There's intergenerational, cross generations. So my father, my mother, compared to our kids, like that's across generations. And there's intragenerational mobility, like within one person's lifetime, where they move up and down in terms of mobility. So the American promise, the American ideal, the American dream is that, man, it's like the sky's the limit, open opportunity, like free mobility, or fairly unrestricted, that people, if they put their nose to the grindstone and work really hard, they can move themselves to any particular position. Well, there's some truth to that. I mean, people have influence over their life destiny, but there's so many other things that are going on that are influencing that. And let's think about, okay, let's look at the degrees of mobility and how do we compare that? So if we look at different countries, again, look at the Norwegian countries and all these different countries, that this is the rank. So Denmark, #1 in terms of social mobility. Then we kind of I just list these out going down from #1, #2, #3, #4. Here's all the Nordic countries in terms of mobility. The UK, so the Great Britain is like very similar to us in a lot of features, economic mobility, a lot of different things that are very similar. They're 21, we're 27th. So we rank 27th of economically developed countries. So we're ranked relatively low in terms of overall mobility. So for us in the United States, the class position that you're born into has much higher degree of influence on mobility over a person's lifetime compared to other countries. And that could be for a lot of different reasons. I mean, access to education to be able to be more mobile, the resources and the dollars for that, social government provision of social services and social things like healthcare and quality education system that's more equitably distributed. I mean, there's a lot of factors that are going in there, but I just want to recognize here that, man, there's variability in terms of mobility itself. In the United States, there's been declining mobility for quite some time. And part of that's the impact of things like globalization that really took off in the 1980s, 1990s. We have these global marketplaces that's different today. Declining union membership. We have one of the lowest union membership rates, and unions are bodies that represent labor and workers. They're the lowest in the world. We have decline in manufacturing, increase in service industries. They have less, just sort of the pay is higher in manufacturing compared to service. A lot of different reasons for a transformation, and we'll talk about a concept called structural social mobility that kind of gets us into that space. Yeah, and the influence of educational level and class stratification over time. I mean, there's different degrees of influence where the value of an education, a college education, is different today than it was in the past. And how do we think about, the college education was more of a gateway for mobility. It still is a lot of economic, I mean, definitely the biggest, there's a lot of advantage for college education. If you're to make an investment, college education, it can be a huge investment and can have, of course, significant impact in terms of economic, but also just personally and socially in a person's lifetime. But the impact on mobility has changed over courses of time. So it's universal, it's variable. So we look at, I'm just going to go through this really fast. Think about taxes are variable, and taxes influence economic distribution in society. The tax rate in the United States went from when the first federal income tax, early 1900s, I think it was 1911. I don't have to go back and look and see what the specific date was, but it went from 8%, and that was everybody. This only were, what the hell was the first? They're not make a projection of with the first year, whether it was only certain individuals, the top paid income taxes. I think that is what it was. There was an intent originally at the tax code that majority of people in society did not pay taxes, that taxes were actually used as a mechanism of redistribution of wealth, and that was intentional. It's changed over time in terms of our ideas about taxes. So right now, it's like the tax rate went from, okay, 1920, it's 78%, then it's dropping down. Then 1950, post-World War II, it's coming down, it's so the marginal tax rate, so tax rate above a certain amount, the highest tax rate was 96%. So if you were really wealthy back in 1950, you paid a 96%, up to 96%. It didn't mean that all of your income was taxed at 90%. It meant once you got to a certain level, above that level was taxed at a rate of 96%. Same here today, the top marginal tax rate, 37%. Once you get to a certain, people pay taxes, everybody pays a tax rate up to, the same tax rate up to a certain point. And then if you get above that point, people are paying a 37% tax rate. I'm just bringing this up here to say it's variable. There's not the magical 37, 28, 70. These are all political decisions. These are not based on like what's needed in the market, I would argue. These are political and social kind of decisions that are being made. I think one thing interesting to look at is the tax revenue as share of gross domestic product, or the productivity of a country. In the economically developed countries, the tax revenue is about 34%. So in those countries, in economically developed countries, those countries gather on average 34% of the goods that are being produced, goods and services, that of all that collective value in the goods and services, 35% is being captured in taxes. In the United States, 24%, France 45, Denmark 43. So this is why, for example, like a universal healthcare system is possible in the United States, but we're going to have to redesign our tax structure. I'm bringing up the issue here that stratification is universal and variable. So we got to get into the question of why is it the United States we're relatively low in terms of tax collection, and then how do we think about what's the impact on society? We think about things like healthcare, universal healthcare is something that we don't have in the United States. Whether we go there or not, big political question, but just trying to introduce the idea that it's these things are variable. We have to get into the kind of culture, history, economics, and a lot of different factors to understand that. There are only 3 other countries that are below us in terms of tax revenue as compared to share of gross domestic product. I think it's important to recognize that stratification is supported by ideologies. Ideologies are beliefs that exist within society, beliefs that support a particular way of organizing society. So if we have a lot of stratification, we have to have some belief to be able to support that. Otherwise, there'd be more active involvement in trying to change that. One ideology is the American dream, the idea that anyone, regardless of the class you're born into, regardless of class, race, that you can be upwardly mobile. So where you end up in society in terms of your stratification, in terms of your position, is more people say it's determined by the self more. People are not restricted. They have opportunities to be able to move themselves to a different position. Maybe not all the way up to the top, but have a lot of degree of mobility. I think, it's kind of interesting for me that there are a lot of different definitions of the American dream omit other parts of our identities like race. And I think it illustrates our dominant kind of cultural view that class, right? That class, people can be mobile. We only not thinking about the ways in which race may interact with the ability to like structural impacts that influence the ability of different groups to be able to be mobile. So, the American dream, is it over? I don't know, there's a lot of questions about that. Was it ever a reality to begin with? Was it a reality for if you were, you were Black living in United States 1940s, was the American dream, was it a reality? I mean, it's a different reality, I'd probably say, than someone who's living, someone of the dominant racial group, someone who's white in that time period. So I think the American dream is a little bit more complicated. It's not like the American dream was available to everyone in the same way. So I'm not sure the American dream was ever really there, but there was more mobility in the past. That's true, and that's true for a lot of different groups. There's some benefits maybe to the American dream that gives us kind of hope and optimism. Americans can be very optimistic, but sometimes if we get overly optimistic and we don't want to look at the reality, I think it can get us into some dangerous spots. So some of the drawbacks of the American dream is it prevents us from looking at the realities of how society might be structured. If I even think back to Merton's strain theory on deviance about the cultural goal of the American dream, and then think about the institutional means to different, within a community, do people have access to the institutions to get the American dream? That if we put so much focus in this belief on the American dream that people can get out of any situation they're in and can be upwardly mobile, if we're not careful and we promote that idea, part of that may be encouraging groups in society to take control over your fate and your future, but also at the same time recognizing if we do that and not recognize the lived realities, we're just starting to blame people for their life situation and where they end up in life. And also, if people aren't successful, we're giving the message that it's because of their own fault, and that can have an impact on the individual as well. I don't know, here's another thing, like an ideology, like, I don't know, comes through, maybe an impact on, how does our ideologies support the distribution like taxes? And think about in the state of Oregon, Intel, an organization, a corporation, paid 0 federal income taxes. I think this is 2018 data or early 2000s data. Oregon taxes are unknown. The state doesn't require that corporations disclose their taxes to the public. I mean, that's kind of interesting. Nike had $46 billion in revenue and had an effective tax rate of federal level 1.3%. So you can go through these different companies, Oregon-based companies, and their effective tax rate. Ideologies support that, right? There's support for that corporations are paying much lower than what's established at the corporate tax rate. And there's a lot of ideology to support that. You could argue, well, that's for economic development and a lot of different kind of things, but I would argue that there's an ideological component to that. So let's kind of move into a couple different ideologies. One of them here, the just world hypothesis. So an ideology, a belief why things are the way that they are. We view the world through a lens of ideology. So we look at the world through this sort of ideology. It's part of our values, our beliefs, the assumptions that we have. We develop an ideology like the ideology that people can, that individual who's experiencing being unhoused or homelessness, like an ideology that, that's their own fault. And this becomes tricky because I'm not saying that people, could make different decisions in life, but sometimes we have this ideology that people are in the situations they're in because they didn't take advantage of opportunities. And we kind of start to go way far in the perspective of blaming individuals. There's a lot of ideology that's supporting that idea. It's a cultural beliefs and ideas that people have been socialized into that support certain way of stratification. So it kind of thinks about Gramsci and a kind of hegemony, domination by consent, right? So that if we have this sort of idea that, it'd be unfair to tax people who are wealthier at a higher tax rate, it'd be bad for our economy, like that idea and that argument, or that'd be unfair. From a Gramsci's viewpoint, this is hegemony, that if people start to get socialized in these values and beliefs, they can start to agree to ideologies that are against their own economic interests and that are supporting a system that's more exploitative and that leads to a greater degree of inequality. And you could argue the American dream is definitely an ideology. The idea of rugged individualism, pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, doesn't address the structure of society, right? It just says, okay, like, man, hard work and being dedicated and being principled, all good values and all beneficial ideas. But there's also a structure that we live in too. Americans tend to have a fascination of rags to riches story. People go from the bottom to the top, and that those stories reinforce an idea that if these individuals made it, therefore everybody else can make it too. And it reinforces this idea that if they just worked hard enough, they could get to that particular position. Well, the reality is that if you're born in the bottom 20%, quintiles, 20% markings, if you're born in the bottom 20%, and then where you end up, kind of like in your, where people end up, people born in the bottom 20%, 42% stay in the bottom 20%, 6% end up at the top 20%. So there is mobility going on, but this is kind of like trying to illustrate that there's structure and class and resources and the communities that we live in, the schools that we attend. There's a lot of things that are influencing that are more than just pulling yourself up by your own bootstraps. There's specific discrimination. Think about the first Supreme Court justice that's female was early 1980s, Sandra Day O'Connor. So it didn't matter how hard a woman worked before that in the legal field. She just did not have an opportunity to be in that space. So there's discrimination that happened. So if we just focus on rugged individualism, we're ignoring things like discrimination. We're ignoring structure and realities there. And then if you're born in the top quintile, the top 20%, from lowest to highest, that 39% stay in that highest quintile. 9% do go down. So there is mobility. It doesn't mean you're born wealthy, you're going to stay there, or you're born rich, you're going to stay there, or born poor, you're going to stay there. It's just, there's a lot of other things going on there. I don't know, I kind of bring up a couple things here. So the ideal rates, this is kind of interesting for me, what Americans view the ideal rate of mobility. Liberals and conservatives, look at this. So Republicans and Democrats, basically we're talking about here, both view what the ideal rate is, but then you get into the actual, right? So there's a discrepancy between what people believe is optimal and what is actually occurring in terms of mobility. Definitely differences between Republicans and Democrats on the way that they view things, that these different groups view the role of hard work versus advantage or structure. percent who say that being poor comes from a lack of effort. Democrats more likely to recognize structure and not focus on the individual. Republicans, conservatives, much more likely to focus on the individual. This is kind of interesting to get into this, like why the change? You know, that's kind of an interesting thing to kind of look at. This one's a interesting kind of trajectory going on here, that people are rich because they've worked harder, greater recognition, or this idea that the wealthy have worked harder, therefore they're deserving. Democrats do not view it that way. I think you need to account for like why the change in growth and development. To me, there's also an interesting factor going on here. I think there's anyway, I'll kind of move on. Americans stand out in this idea of individualism, of rugged individualism. So this is a chart. It's about what 2014, so maybe a little bit dated, but I don't think these values change all that much over a period of time. So this idea that, okay, percent who disagree that life is determined by things that are outside your control. So that structures determine your life. People who disagree with that, Americans disagree. Americans don't see place a lot of focus on the ways in which structure influences the outcome of people's lives. And say it's very important to work really hard. Americans tend to focus on it's hard work, right? Just work hard, therefore you'll be able to get there and do that. This is a really provocative video, and you can like type this into a search engine. You can get it and look at it. I can't share it here with you just because it'll get flagged. My lecture here. But one thing I want to kind of indicate here, I put this image here. Percent. This is the ideal Americans, what they think about wealth, which is all your assets, stocks, everything you have in your bank account, everything you have in your home. So this is what Americans think that the ideal distribution would be. And what Americans think it actually is. This is based on research a couple social psychologists did of looking at this kind of factor. This is what Americans think the actual distribution is, but this is the reality. And this kind of tells me that, man, we have collectively a very distorted view of wealth distribution in the United States. We're significantly off in terms of the way we think about wealth distribution. And this video will give you a lot of information or a perspective that's really, I don't know, it's like, wow, man, I didn't realize the degree to which a very small percent of Americans hold a significant amount of wealth, and that influences politics, legislation, tax code. I mean, here becomes an issue of stratification, right? All right, so let's kind of move on a little bit. Another way of thinking about stratification, or how do we support that in ideology, or maybe a different way of supporting it, it's this idea of the just world hypothesis. Social psychologist Melvin Lerner, the work that he did on looking at how do people kind of explain hardship, difficulty, problems that people are experiencing in society. His argument is there is a thinking bias that we have, that's part of humans. And that we attribute, like an attribution theory, what do we attribute the cause of either like my life or somebody else's life, like, or the decisions that they make? Like, what are we attributing the reasons for those decisions? And there's a fundamental attribution kind of error that we can start to blame individuals for their life circumstances. And we got to separate out. People definitely have responsibility for life choices. It's not saying people don't have responsibility, but sometimes we see that, like, I made where I'm at in my life today, I did that because I worked really hard. They ended up where they did because they didn't work really hard. If somebody's like in a lower social class position than myself, that's like gets us into a fundamental attribution error, holding different standards for different people. It's part of that. And there's a bias going on here. So what Lerner's argument is, I think it's pretty provocative, is that there's a tendency to blame individuals in order for us to rationalize the injustice that's out there in the world and the suffering that's out there in the world. And if you're driving around the community and you see people who are experiencing homelessness, people who are unhoused, people asking for money, people who are at the street corner, whatever it may be, that can be hard on us. I mean, it can be hard on individuals to be able to see that kind of suffering. And what Lerner gets into is that people start to develop within culture and as well as individuals, we start to develop an idea that the world is fair. It's much more predictable. It's much more fair. People don't want, it's not that people want hardships to happen to people, but it's kind of like a cognitive dissonance has been created. I'm living a life of comfort. They're living a life of suffering. Is my comfort in part related to their suffering, and my economic gain in part coming from impacting other people? It's a lot of dissonance being created. So people start to create an idea that the world is a just place. Humans seek someone to blame or something to blame when they see injustice. And a just world idea is a way to rationalize things. Americans tend to focus on individual behavior, and we reinforce this idea of this just world that people had the opportunity, they just didn't take of the opportunity, or whatever variation of that theme is related to this sort of just world hypothesis. People get what they deserve. This is related to outside of even economics and social class. Think about different things in life. If they didn't put themselves in that position, that wouldn't have happened to them. It's a just world hypothesis idea. You get out what you put in. They made the choice. These are all variations on that theme. This is a great video explaining the just world hypothesis. I highly encourage you to watch it. And then this captures the idea really well that it was whatever happens to people, it's self-created. All right, so theories of stratification. Let's kind of go there. Being mindful of time here a little bit. 3 theories. Functionalism, basically, it's called the Davis-Moore thesis. 2 different sociologists, 1950s, come up with this idea that all societies are stratified, therefore it has a function. What does stratification do? And stratification, one way of looking at it is that actually maybe stratification, we need it in society to provide different rewards for different positions that require more responsibility, more sacrifice of dollars, or there's more stressful, whatever it may be. So we need to have some degree of stratification to encourage people to make the sacrifices to take on positions that require a lot of sacrifice, education, whatever it might be. So I look at, for example, look at healthcare, look at a hospital, look at the difference in terms of what people make. Education's part of this, responsibility is part of this. What is their role within the institution, part of this. So I would say there's probably some truth to that idea, but where the functionalist perspective is going to fall short is, well, how much difference between the family practice physician and the home health aide? How much is needed in terms of providing differential reward? The average CEO in the United States, senior executive officer, corporate executive officer, earns 270 times to 1 of the average worker. Back in the 1970s, it was 30 to 1. So, I mean, functionalism is going to have a hard time addressing or cannot address why that degree of difference. There may be some utility for having some degree of stratification. I think you could create that argument and support that argument. But to what degree is going to be something that a functionalist can't answer. Conflict theory perspective on stratification is going to go back to the means of production. Are you a worker? Are you an owner? Do you have the control over labor? We look at unionization rates in the United States. The United States has a history of a lot of atrocities towards unions, very, very difficult for people to become unionized. There's a union kind of a labor movement going on in the United States now, which is relatively and been re-energized, I would say. Starbucks, Amazon, corporations. Kind of interesting that this gives you an indication of why it's so difficult in the United States to become unionized. We have the lowest, second to lowest, but all theoretical purposes, the lowest unionization rate of any industrialized country. Unions are labor organizations that represent laborers or workers. In a lot of countries, they organize labor based on whole segments of the economy, not store by store. So for example, in Starbucks employees are trying to organize, they have to go store by store to organize. In other countries, they do it across whole institutions or whole segments of the economy. So service workers are organized, and it's all companies within the service industry. If legislation gets passed, It impacts all workers, all institutions in that industry. Such a different model. Conflict theory, you get into this inequity. Yeah, it's like the interest of the capital versus the interest of the workers, and there's a divide going on there. And the United States, there's a lot, I think, a lot of the inequality that we have, it's not inevitable. There's a lot of variability, and there's a lot of social policies that are actually influencing that. And we could look at, I think, conflict theory, there's an argument to be made that there's a lot of stuff going on about power, distribution of power, and who's controlling the system and influencing the system, and to what benefit or for who. We could go through vacation days. There's 0 federal required vacation days in the United States. United States is the only economic developed country does not have paid maternity leave for someone to access maternity leave. They have to apply for short-term disability. It's just an odd system. We don't have universal health care. And the reasons I bring up these countries say they're capitalist countries. So it's not that capitalism precludes or does not allow for greater involvement of government involvement in providing resources for the collective good, but the United States has a different history. So we have to get into history and culture to understand that. Go back to the Gini coefficient. I don't know, this is kind of interesting comparison to me. I started thinking about the average worker, the average CEO, and I wanted to look at COCC. Minimum wage, if you're a minimum wage worker at the college, you make about $28,000 a year. The president makes somewhere around 220. That's about 8 times the average worker at COCC. And I just can't even imagine working at an institution that'd be 270 to 1. Of course, there's going to be a lot of layering in between the two, but I don't know, it just kind of gave me a perspective on it. Okay, so a lot of information I know. So oh man, let me talk about social reproduction. I think a really important concept. And I'll give you kind of a real quick version of it. So Pierre Bourdieu, a French theorist, talks about how stratification gets reproduced socially through our social learning and the environment that we are in, our family network, our peer network, the schools we go to, the institutions that we've interacted in throughout our life. And we start to develop ways of thinking, knowing, doing, what he calls our habitus. And this influences how social class gets reproduced. So part of our class position, we develop social capital, our networks, and we can access our networks to get advantage in a particular system. We can, so let's see, okay, what we learn. Okay, well, I'll go there in a minute. So social reproduction is going to have this it's what we learn. It's our habitus, our ways of thinking, knowing. It's all of our environment influences. We have social capital, our networks. We can access those to get into institutions or to it's job opportunities. A job comes up and you know somebody in that industry or your family does, right? This is social capital. Then we have cultural capital, which is our things that we know, our experiences, our language, our habits, our dress, our demeanor, things that we've learned throughout our life that are class situated that can influence outcomes in life. Annette LaRue and her work on unequal childhoods is really fascinating. She spent time in middle class, working class communities, families. She talks about this cultural logic of parenting. Neither parent is, style parent. There's different styles of parenting based on working class, middle class, professional middle class. Her argument is neither one is better, better or worse than the other. Kids that grow up in a professional middle class background it's a model of concerted cultivation where parents are trying to cultivate certain ways of thinking, knowing, doing to position them well for college and then professional jobs later on in life. And for working class, more about natural growth, more autonomy for kids, self-development. She sees a band of it, she sees that neither one is correct. They're both expressions of their own class position, but there's an institutional advantage for the kids who are growing up in a professional middle class environment where they're developing cultural capital and access to social capital to get them into a more privileged position within systems themselves. So what we learn, how we know it, shaped by class position, that's the reality. There's nothing good about it, but there are institutional advantages. So for example, if you come from a working class community and you need to have an electrician, you may know people in that community and you can access an electrician faster than maybe somebody in the professional middle class. there's a benefit there. But then we think about what if you're going up a professional middle class background and you grow up around lawyers and doctors and you have access to institutions. Well, there's a much more significant institutional advantage for positions that have a lot more power, authority, and generation of income. Here's a video. If you're interested, you can type that in there and you can get there. I'll try to keep this to like 10 more minutes to kind of get us there. Think about the myth of meritocracy. Meritocracy is this idea that the merit, hard work, skills, talent, that determines where people end up. So those who have the most talent, those who are the most skilled, those who work the hardest, those who are most dedicated, they end up that we live in a meritocracy, right? That our stratification is determined by hard work, dedication, skill set that people have. And again, it's like there's some truth to this, but it's like the reason it's a myth is because it's much more complicated than that. It's not only based on marriage. What about, the privileges that people have or discrimination? Like this is not looking at those kind of things. So sometimes we believe in the United States or other places that we live in a meritocracy. And if we go there, that ideal culture without looking at the practice culture, we're going to get into some pretty difficult spots where we are ignoring kind of reality. So the term actually gets introduced in the 1950s. Michael Young, British Labour Party representative, and he's actually concerned that there's a growing inequality going on, and there's a growing belief that this idea that people who are wealthier deserve it. And there's a belief going around that the individuals with more wealth and more income, they're working harder, they have greater skills. This is why they're there. And he's actually providing a critique and saying we don't live in a meritocracy, but this idea starts to get incorporated, and we start, the United States and the UK start to have this sort of idea that we're no longer in an aristocracy. It's not based on landed nobility. So it's meritocracy. It's how hard you work. Well, this is, it's myth. There's some partial truth to this, but it's much more complicated. So with globalization, 1970s, 1980s, a different economic world, we started believing, if we focus on, just work harder and develop more skills, well, there can be value in that for sure, but also it fails to address the inequalities that are out there, the job market. It reinforces this meritocratic idea, reinforces an individualistic view without looking at structure itself, declining unionization, other factors that are going on there. What about luck, the role that luck plays? Americans tend to undervalue luck. If it just happened to be in the right place at the right time, or the job, is rewarding me, there's a lot of luck involved in that. Americans tend to undervalue luck. Luck isn't merit-based. It's just happened to be at the right place, right time. All these things are valuable virtues. And the assumption from a meritocratic viewpoint is that those who are higher up have more of those virtues. This myth or the idea of meritocracy is it's a myth, and it reinforces the story of meritocracy, reinforces inequality and perpetuates individualism. If you're interested, check out a podcast, Michael Sandel, The Tyranny of Merit. I think is a great example. I'm not going to spend time here giving you an example. It's just an example. It's going to continue on, but think about colleges where people end up. I'm going to bypass this too, but just or maybe just like a brief moment. There can be a viewpoint that groups that are in poverty are there because there's a culture of poverty that's intergenerational. This goes back to research 1950s, 1960s. Oscar Lewis, a cultural anthropologist, believing or advocating or promoting an idea that people who are poor start to develop values and ways of thinking and knowing and doing, and that gets intergenerational, gets passed on generations, and it traps people in poverty. And there's been a lot of critique of this model, but it's still out there in our culture. People believe that, whether it's that particular, it's racial subgroups and people who are poor, whites who are poor, that they live in a subculture of poverty. It's a cultural issue. But there's been a lot of critique of that model. And again, rather than blaming the individual, now we're just blaming culture, and we're not looking at structure. There's a lot of myth about welfare dependency. I think this is important to know that there's been a long history in the United States of separating out who's deserving of government assistance and who's undeserving, and how do we make that distinction between the two. In 1996, Clinton, Democrat, ended welfare as we know it. So this signaled a new an introduction of a new Democrat and the Democrats became much more conservative and walked away from labor unions and addressing structural inequalities. Clinton was very conservative in a lot of his policies, as well as Obama as well. I mean, favored labor, or very favored capital over labor. But if I look at like welfare, people think about welfare, like the income benefit for individuals who qualify for income benefit programs, that you have, first of all, to qualify, federal poverty line for a family of four in 2020 was 26,000. If you made $7.25 an hour, you'd make $14,000, $15,000 a year. So it tells you, like, it's going to be difficult, like, what do you need to qualify? You're in a economically, incredibly struggling position to begin with. Only 23% of families in poverty actually receive benefits. Oregon actually has a pretty high rate of benefit access, and I think that's a good thing. TANF restrictions, you only can receive TANF benefits for 16 months over your course of your lifetime. And it's $500 a month in the state of Oregon. There's a lot of construction to this idea of welfare dependency, and there's a lot of myth to that. All right, so last concept, structural social mobility, an important concept to look at the structure of society is impacting the degree of mobility. I think a lot of 20-year-olds today are realizing structural social mobility, issues of affordable housing, wages, consciousness about labor and labor unions, access to education. Are aware that something is different in their generation versus the generation before or generation before. So one way of looking at structural social mobility, you just look at, okay, how is life different today versus for you versus the previous generation or two back? We live in a different structure. So something has happened to the structure that's influenced degree of mobility. So we have deindustrialization, moving away from manufacturing. We had factories where in the United States were much more prominent to service-oriented jobs, and we outsourced manufacturing to China, India, other places around the world. You look at where your garments are produced, very rarely is it in the United States. All these other countries, labor conditions are different, regulation of the environment different. There's a reason why our clothes don't cost as much, and we spend more, we consume more. There's a lot of deindustrialization. Manufacturing jobs paid more than service jobs. We lived in a different environment. We also have technologies different today than it was before. We know the jobs that are available at high-tech jobs require more and more education. The gap between workers who have an education and those who did not in the past was much more narrow. Now it's grown more, but the cost of education has grown more too. So we have a different kind of structure going on there. More jobs being automated. So think about like manufacturing, you take a different level of skill, different educational background, and a lot of different jobs working within different industries. Trade policies that tend to have been hard on labor, especially in the United States. A lot of anti-union stuff in the United States. Minimum wage is not kept up with inflation over historical time periods. And so we have a conundrum, a lot of challenges going on. There's a powerful book. This is a little bit dated. I think it came out maybe in the 1990s, When Work Disappears, William Julius Wilson, African-American sociologist from Harvard, who basically look at crime and social disorganization in communities when work disappears. It's the title of the book tells it all. What happens when jobs disappear? Well, things happen, right? The breakdown of the community. Well, and then if we take the role, we need to have probably a different role of law enforcement in that place. But if we're not also being mindful of actually trying to redevelop that community, we're not addressing that structural kind of conditions. This is a little bit more closer to home. Nicholas Kristof in the book called Tightrope, I think I mentioned it before, but just another example about like more locally in Oregon that, structure shifted when lumber and mills were much more prominent in Oregon, much more vital part of the different communities when mills shut down and moved or, became reorganized in a different way. Jobs moved, people lost jobs. What happened in some communities were devastated, and that's had long-term implications. I'll just give you kind of a couple different charts. This is like looking at long-term perspective, like structural mobility. This is 1970, the share of total income in the United States that The middle class has declined in terms of total income, and the upper income has grown. So basically, just trying to say that there's a growing gap between the top and the bottom. And if you want to look at it, really, it's the 0.1% where it's been leaps and bounds. And the bottom 20, 40% has been relatively stable over the last 40 years. But the cost to participate in society has significantly gone up. So that becomes a challenge that in the past, people born in the 1960s, the gap between those with a bachelor's degree versus high school education, it was relatively small. Now let's look into that gap between those two. And that is a huge difference in terms of a structural shift. And then finally, if you look at this is, I think, an interesting, the cost of a college degree. So looking at in 2,300 public colleges and private colleges and universities, tuition, room, board fees. If you adjust it for inflation in 87, that cost of education approximately $40,000 a year to now $104,000 a year. At Oregon State, 1987, 33,500. Now it's $90,000 a year. Huge structural shift. Not everybody has the opportunity to be able to do that. Community college becomes an access point for more students. But I would argue that we're not addressing the larger structure and like labor and things like that. We're not addressing the underlying problems that are creating that gap between the top and the bottom. It's universal, but it's variable. There's things that are going on at a macro level, legislative level, policy level, tax level, labor representation level, a lot of different factors. We can get into ideologies that help support stratification and justify it, that people end up where they are because of their hard work or dedication, meritocracy view, or just world hypothesis. When we see the struggle and the hardship and the inequity, that we provide some sort of, we try to get rid of that dissonance and say, man, the world is kind of a just place. I feel bad for people, but there's nothing I can do. It's kind of they just need to take more to do more for themselves kind of thing. I mean, it kind of fits into that perspective. All right, so that's the social stratification. A lot of stuff to uncover. It's a huge area to investigate. We just touched down on these topics throughout the course of the term. Hope you found that kind of thought-provoking, a lot of things to consider. Have a great rest of your day, great rest of your week. Be safe, be well, and until next time.